There's a moment at the boat ramp, right at the end of a long, late summer day, that will tell you more about a lake than any map ever printed. 5 boats come in inside of 20 minutes. Same water, same weather, same sunrise, and you get 5 completely different stories about what happened out there. One found them shallow, up a creek, pinned against bait in 4 feet of water. The next one swears the shallow bite is finished, and he had to grind an offshore hump. A third never touched bottom all day. His fish were floating in open water, 10 feet down over 30. Most people standing on that concrete assume 4 out of those 5 are lying. I think there's a better explanation. All 5 of them are telling the truth. The lake is just running more than one season at the same time. I've watched anglers chase this for years, and the bad version of the day is always the same. It's the last week of August. There's one cool night, maybe 2. The morning smells different, and something in you decides the switch has flipped. So you point the boat at the backs of the creeks, because that's what you're supposed to do when fall starts. You run 20 minutes. Nothing. You run 20 more. One short strike and a bluegill that swings at a bait half its size. By early afternoon, you're down to a quarter tank, and there's one keeper in the box. And the boat that never left the first cove had a limit before 9 in the morning. That day costs real money. Gas, daylight, and the part of the trip you were actually looking forward to. And the thing that stings is that you did exactly what the calendar told you to do. So before we're done, I'll hand you a 30-minute test. 3 10-minute blocks that end with you picking one of 3 game plans instead of driving around hoping. No expensive electronics required. And somewhere in the middle of this, there's a state fisheries study that quietly rearranged how I think about the word transition. Let's start with a question, because the question is the part that's broken. Standing at the ramp in late August, almost everybody asks the same thing. Has it started yet? Has the lake gone fall? That question has no useful answer, because the lake doesn't answer as a unit. The better question is smaller and a whole lot more honest. Which part of this lake changed first, and what exactly changed about it? A bass doesn't own a calendar. It doesn't own a thermometer either. In late summer, a bass is solving 4 problems at once, and every single one of them is local. Food, oxygen, ambush, comfort. 4 letters, F.O.A.C. It isn't a formula, it's a filter, and it explains why a spot that looks perfect in a photograph can be stone dead in person. A gorgeous grass edge with no bait on it is a parking lot with landscaping. A cloud of bait over open nothing is a buffet nobody can hunt. And cool water with no oxygen under it isn't deep water at all. It's a floor. That last one deserves a story, because it took a mystery to figure out. Back in the 70s, big striped bass in some southern reservoirs started dying every summer, and nobody could say why. The fish that died were the good ones. Big, old, and thin. Pollution got blamed first, then metals, then power plants. A researcher at a national laboratory in Tennessee put tracking tags in those fish and followed them through the hot months. What he found wasn't poison, it was a squeeze. The top of the lake had gotten too warm for a big fish to sit in, and the deep water that was cool enough had almost no oxygen left in it. They were pinned into a thin band between the two, and in a bad summer, that band got thinner still. He called it the temperature oxygen squeeze, and it's been tested and argued over for more than 30 years since. I'll be straight with you. That work was built on striped bass, not largemouth, and I won't pretend it maps cleanly onto your farm pond. But the shape of it is the useful part. Here's the so what. There may be 30 feet of water under your boat, and only 12 feet of it worth fishing. The number on your depth finder is not the number that matters. Usable depth is. State conservation agencies describe the same layering in plain language. A warm upper layer, a thin band where temperature falls off fast, and a bottom layer that, in plenty of waters, can be scrubbed of oxygen by the middle of July. Those same agencies also say something anglers skip right over. Not every water body does this. Some stay mixed top to bottom all summer. So the first move in reading late summer isn't picking a lure. It's asking how much of this water is even alive today. Which brings me to the word that wastes more casts than any other word in bass fishing. Shallow. We use it to mean close to the bank. But a fish suspended 8 feet down over 35 feet of water is living in 8 feet of water. That's a shallow fish. He just doesn't have a shoreline. Once you hear that, some ugly days start making sense. You idle out, see 30 plus on the screen, and reach for something built to dig the bottom, while the fish are riding up in the top third, following bait, never once looking down. You didn't fish deep water that day. You fished under them. The fix costs nothing. Cast out, and before you turn the handle, count. 1001, 1002. Most bass lures sink somewhere around a foot a second, give or take, depending on weight and line. So a 5 count puts you near 5 feet down, 3 casts to the same water at 3 different counts, and you've sampled the column instead of guessing at it. Nobody sells you counting. There's no patent on it, no seasonal color, no shelf space at the front of the store. It's free, it works, and that's exactly why you've never seen a commercial for it. Now here's the part that broke my own mental model, and I think it might break yours. Texas Parks and Wildlife ran a tracking study on 2 of the most famous bass lakes in the country, Toledo Bend and Lake Fork. 43 fish tagged in one, 38 in the other, all of them between 16 and 24 inches, followed for 2 years. They expected what everybody talks about, seasonal movement, fish sliding out deep in summer, then marching into the creeks in fall. That's not what came back. On Lake Fork, the average total home range across the entire study was around 60 acres or less, and the core area a fish actually used was just over 10 acres. Movement looked about the same in all 4 seasons, and there was no great parade back and forth between the bank and the offshore stuff. Some fish were shallow fish, some fish were offshore fish. That was simply who they were. Sit with that for a second, because it changes the whole shape of the problem. In those 2 lakes, the fall transition wasn't a migration, it was a change in which residents became catchable. The shallow fish were always there. The offshore fish were always there. What moves is bait, oxygen, light, and pressure, and those things move at different speeds in different arms of the same lake. So on the day you burned half a tank running to the backs of the creeks, you weren't behind the fish, you were driving past them. I'll be fair about the limits, because I'd rather you trust me later. 2 Texas reservoirs, mostly larger fish, and other tracking work elsewhere, found individual bass whose daily movement varied by as much as 25 times from one fish to the next. So the honest version isn't bass never move, it's that bass are far more individual than any seasonal chart is willing to admit. Which means you need better proof than a hunch before you commit a whole day. Here's the rule I'd give a friend. Never declare a seasonal pattern off 1 clue. Require 3. Shad up shallow is a clue. Base blowing up on them is a second. The same thing repeating in a pocket a mile away, with the same wind on it, that's a pattern. 1 occurrence is a story. 3 is something you can spend gas on. And be careful what you write down. Somebody catches 2 off a shaded dock, declares a dock pattern, then burns 4 hours running docks that never had a chance. But the dock wasn't the reason. The reason was shade, plus bait, plus about 5 feet of water, plus deeper water close enough to vanish into. A laydown with that same combination will hold fish. A dock without it won't. Copy the conditions, not the object. Now, 1 piece of vocabulary that gets abused every single September. Turnover. 2 cool nights, the water looks a little off, the bite changes, and somebody at the ramp announces the lake is turning over. It's the most popular excuse in freshwater fishing, and most of the time it isn't happening yet. Turnover is a physical event, not a mood. The upper layer has to cool until it's dense enough to sink and mix, and agencies generally describe that as things fall toward the 50-degree range. In late August, in most of this country, you're nowhere close. Late summer transition and lake turnover are 2 different animals, and they can be months apart. Bass change addresses long before the water column ever mixes. So before you blame turnover, walk the cheaper list. Did the bait leave? Did the wind switch sides? Did they start or stop pulling water? Did the level drop a foot? Were 3 boats here before you got up? That list solves a lot more slow mornings than the word turnover ever has. Speaking of arguments that go nowhere. Power fishing versus finesse fishing. I'd throw that whole debate out and replace it with one question. Am I searching or am I extracting? Search mode has one job, and it isn't catching. It's information. A moving bait that covers water and gets seen from a distance is a survey tool. A blow-up that misses still told you something enormous. So did the follow. So did the wake. Extraction starts the second you get that information. You slow down, come back from a different angle, and give them something easy, in the exact zone where the fish showed himself. A fast bait's real value is often that it reveals fish, not that it lands them. And when you pick what to hand them, don't stop at matching the hatch. Everybody says match the hatch, then translates it into small shad, small lure. In late summer, that's not enough, because your lake may be feeding bass 3 or 4 things at once. Threadfin out in open water, bluegill around the grass and the docks, frogs in the pads, crawfish on the rocks. The better question isn't what the prey looks like, it's how the prey is vulnerable. Shad pushed against the surface are vulnerable because they can't go up, and something walking across the top matches that mistake. A bluegill pinned to a grass wall is vulnerable because it's cornered, and a compact bait falling right at that edge matches that mistake. Suspended bait is vulnerable at exactly one depth, and if you're not at that depth, you might as well be at the ramp. The right lure is usually the one that copies the prey's mistake, not just its body. One more piece of common wisdom worth putting a dent in. The morning bite died. Maybe. Or maybe the morning bite got compressed. At daylight, food and shade and easy light are spread all over, and so are the fish. As the sun climbs, all of it gets squeezed into fewer options. Shade lines, grass canopy, the dark side of a dock, a current seam, the deep edge of a flat. The fish didn't stop eating. Your job changed. Morning, you fish areas. Midday, you fish objects. And the objects worth fishing are the ones with shade or current or an edge attached. And while we're there, one free upgrade almost nobody uses. That same Texas study also looked at how those bass responded to boat noise. About 59% of the relocated fish reacted in some way. The bigger fish, the ones over 20 inches, were more likely to react. Fish sitting in vegetation reacted more often than fish that weren't. The takeaway isn't complicated. Get in front of the fish before the fish knows you exist. Kill the big motor early. Long cast first, close cast second. Set things down instead of dropping them. Nobody has figured out how to sell you quiet. That's the whole reason it stays invisible. All right, the payoff. This is the part worth writing on the back of your hand. 30 minutes, 3 blocks, 1 decision at the end. First 10 minutes, test shallow. Pick one high-percentage pocket, ideally with wind pushing into it. Before you cast, spend 60 seconds just looking. Bait flickering on the surface? Nervous water? Birds working? Is the grass green and crisp, or brown and slimy? Are bluegill popping bugs against the bank? Then throw a moving bait and cover it fast. You're not grading fish caught. You're grading life present. Second 10 minutes, test the edge. Slide out to where shallow becomes not shallow. The creek mouth, a secondary point. The outside grass line, the end of the dock row, a drop that runs near the channel. Work the mid-depth zone and read direction. Are they on top of the drop, down on the bottom of it, or scattered across the face? On top usually means the shallow game is live. Down on the bottom edge means it hasn't come yet. Final 10 minutes. Test the upper column offshore, and here's where most people beat themselves. Do not automatically go to the bottom. Set up over deeper water near where bait would travel and use that countdown. 3 casts, 3 counts. A 5, then a 10, then a 15. If you have sonar, find the bait clouds and the depth they're holding, and keep your bait just above them. Fish look up far better than they look down. Now you decide and you commit. Plan A. You found life shallow. That's your day. Stay up there, keep it moving, and let the bait tell you where to slow down. Plan B. The action was on the edge. That's a transition day. Set up where deep and shallow shake hands, and work that seam instead of running the whole lake. Plan C. Nothing shallow, nothing on the edge, but something showed up high over deep water. That's the suspended game, and depth control matters more than lure choice. And if all 3 blocks came back empty, that's information too. Something's off in that arm of the lake. Move to a different arm instead of a different lure. Here's the part I want to leave you with. Almost everything I just described is free. Counting to 5, looking before you cast, requiring 3 clues, staying quiet, copying conditions instead of objects. None of it can be patented, packaged, or reissued next season in a new color. And that's exactly why the tackle industry has no particular reason to remind you it exists. It isn't a conspiracy. Nobody makes a living selling patience. So think back to those 5 boats at the ramp. 1 lake, 5 stories, all of them true. 1 found the arm that changed early. 1 found the arm that hadn't. 1 found the fish that were never going to be near a bank in the first place. Late summer isn't when the bass disappear, it's when your lake quits behaving like one lake. Stop asking whether fall has started. Start asking which piece of your water moved first, and go stand in that piece. And whatever you do out there, check your state and local regulations before you go. Seasons, limits, and bait rules are different from state to state, and sometimes from lake to lake. I put the whole 30-minute system into a free field guide. The 3-block test, the search versus extraction chart, the forage decision tree, and a printable checklist for the boat. Links in the description, no email required. And I want to hear from the people who actually fish these lakes. Which pocket on your water always changes first, and how do you know? And be honest with me on this one. When you say your lake turned over, are you sure that's what happened, or was the bait just gone?